Good morning. Before we begin our lesson on solving division equations using multiplication, which we're going to find on page 19 in our Solving Equations number 4 packet, I want to build some background for some of the steps we're going to encounter. We can write any whole number or integer in fraction form by placing it over 1. So this is what it looks like. If I can write 5 in fraction form, it would be 5 over 1. 5 divided by 5, 5 divided by 1 is the same thing as 5. So this is the fraction way to say the number 5. And we're going to need to know that. So what do you think? How would we write the number 12 as a fraction? We can write it as 12 over 1. The same thing applies for negative numbers. So if we had a negative 7, I would write that as negative 7 over 1. So how do you think we would write negative 16 in fraction form? It is negative 16 over 1, and that's one of the concepts that we will use. Next concept is this can be written in reverse. For instance, if we're given 8 over 1, we can write that as 8. So the fraction form of this number, 8 over 1, can be written as the whole number form as 8. The same thing applies if I have a negative integer. If I have negative 25 over 1, I can write that as negative 25. So fraction way to say this number, integer, or negative number way to say this integer. So now as we move towards solving, when we see division, and this means x divided by 4, the opposite operation is multiplication. So the opposite of division is multiplication. And we can use 3 ways to get a coefficient of 1, which is what we want, in order to isolate the variable. We want the variable all by itself. We don't want to see divided by 4. So we're going to go after a coefficient of 1. And here's how we're going to do that. There's 3 different ways. So you've probably noticed that this resembles a fraction. It kind of looks like x as a numerator and 4 as a denominator in fraction form. So one of the ways I can create a coefficient of 1 is to take 4 over 1 and multiply this. What I'm doing is I'm using 4, which is the numerator, the denominator, the bottom number, but I'm also using an opposite operation. So what happens here is I'm seeing division, so that's why I'm using multiplication. And I want 4, I'm dividing by 4, so I want to multiply by 4. I'm just choosing to write 4, though, in fraction form. So if I have 4 over 1 times x over 4, the operation of multiplication when I'm using fractions, I go straight across 4 times x, so numerator times numerator, and then 1 times 4, denominator times denominator, and I'm going to get 4x over 4. And just like in our last lesson, here is my coefficient of 1. 4 divided by 4 is 1, and 1 times x. Now I have my variable x by itself. That's why we're doing this. So there's another way to show the same thing, but it's a shortcut, and you can decide what helps you. Since I, once again, am dividing by 4, the opposite of dividing by 4 is to multiply by 4. But I'm just going to use the shortcut. I'm going to go directly to 4 times x. And that's where I ended up here. I ended up saying 4x divided by 4. And once again, I have a coefficient of 1 here, leaving the x by itself. That's the goal, is to get x isolated. So the final way, if you watch the Math Antics video that was posted the other day, he just shows you to multiply by 4, because the opposite of multiplying, the opposite of dividing rather, is to multiply. And he just writes it right next to the entire expression. And once again, what happens is that these 4's cancel out. It's really creating a coefficient of 1. It might not be as evident as it is this way or this way, but because I'm doing an opposite operation, I'm given division, so I'm going to multiply. They cancel each other out, once again leaving the x. And we're going to use this concept now when we try to solve equations. So please turn to page 19 in your packet. Okay, we're going to use all those previous concepts to help us solve division equations using multiplication. And I'm going to be honest, this is the most challenging of our solving one-step equations. And I just want to remind you that there are many things that are challenging in life, like when you're a baby, learning to walk was challenging. And you didn't give up on it, you just kept on getting up and trying it, and sometimes you'd fall down, but you keep on trying it. And that's what's going to happen with this. We might have to keep at this for a while until we become comfortable. So don't give up on yourself. Don't think it's always going to be difficult. It's just going to take some practice. So we're going to solve the following equations using multiplication. And that's because we're going to be given division in each one of these equations. So be sure to show the inverse operation. That means the solving step on both sides. And we want to show each step and circle the solution. So I'm going to hold off on showing you the check, but what I'd like you to do right now is set up the check below. So here are our equations, and we're working with just whole numbers, meaning positive numbers. And down below here it says show your check. So right now what I want you to do, if you'll please on your paper, copy the original problem for me. And I hope you're using a pencil because we're going to need an eraser later on. So I see n divided by 5 equals 3 for letter A, and I see y divided by 10 equals 6 for letter B, and then b divided by 3 equals 4. So we're eventually going to use the check, but we'll do that after we talk about the solving. So let's think about what this means for a minute. I see n divided by 5, and we want the n by itself. So the opposite of division, as we just talked about, is multiplication. So I'm going to show that I'm multiplying by 5. So I'm going to choose, because this side looks like a fraction, I'm going to choose to use it as 5 over 1. I'm multiplying by 5, I'm just writing 5 in fraction form. And because we have to do the same thing on both sides, I could write it as 5 over 1, but since this 3 is a whole number, I'd rather use 5 as a whole number. So let's just clarify that 5 over 1 is the same thing as 5. Same meaning in math, just different way to express it. I'm multiplying on both sides, so I'm doing the same inverse operation. And what this is going to accomplish for me is when I take 5 times n, I'm going to get 5n, and 1 times 5 is 5 on that particular side, and on the other side, 3 times 5 is 15. So I have one more step now when I use this in fraction form, because my goal is to get n by itself. So if I realize 5 divided by 5 is 1, and using the identity property, 1 times anything, or 1 times n in this case, is just going to be n. There it is, my variable. Yay! And we've already established that the other side equals 15. So let's try that again. I know it's very confusing when you see this the first time. Again, we want to say that this is y divided by 10, and that's going to equal 6. Well, the side with the variable is always where we start. We're trying to figure out what's being done to the variable. It's being divided by 10, and we want to do the opposite, which would be multiplying by 10. So I'm going to multiply by 10, but since y divided by 10 looks like a fraction, I'm going to choose to write my 10 in fraction form. And once again, whatever we do on one side of an equation when we're solving it, we have to do on the other side. But since 6 is not a fraction, or doesn't look like a fraction, I'm going to use a whole number version of 10. So I am doing the same thing. I'm just choosing to write 10 in a different way. So, just like problem letter A, when I take numerator times a numerator in fraction form, I get 10y, and this denominator times this denominator, 1 times 10 would be 10. And on the other side, 6 times 10 would be 60. So I have one more step, and that's to isolate the variable. And the great news, when I have any number divided by itself, 10 divided by 10 is 1. 1 times y is now just y, and my answer is 60. So I'd like you to pause the video and try letter C on your own. The answer, or what you should have done, should be to multiply by 3 on both sides. I'm using 3 as a fraction. That should be a times sign. And over here I'm going to use 3 as a whole number. So I'm doing the same thing on both sides. This is going to result in 3b divided by 3, and this will result in 12. And then I can use my identity property to say 3 divided by 3 is 1, and 1 times b is b. So b, the answer, is 12. So now I want to show you how to do a check. And frankly, sometimes the check has been difficult or more challenging for students. The check is very important when we do problems like this, or very challenging. However, I don't want to confuse you with learning how to solve. So I'm just going to show you how to do a check, and then I'm not going to insist on it right now. I'm more interested in your learning how to do the solving. But I do want to show you what a check looks like, and maybe you can do a mental check when we do this. We think that the answer to A is n equals 15. So I want to check it. And how I check it is I take my answer 15 and I put it where the n is. So I'm going to erase that variable, and I'm going to replace it with my number 15. And I'm having trouble erasing it, so I think I'm just going to go directly to, and I'm going to replace it with 15. And I'm going to say, is 15 divided by 5 equal to 3? And it is. So I now know that my answer is indeed 15. For problem letter B, we think the solution is y equals 60. So I'm going to take my 60 and I'm going to replace it where the y is. So right here, this y, and hopefully you have an eraser that's working, unlike mine, I'm going to replace it with 60. And I'm going to ask myself, is 60 divided by 10 equal to 6? And it is. So now I know my answer of 60, y equals 60, is correct. Would you please try that on your own for letter B? Hopefully you replace B with 12, and 12 divided by 3 is indeed 4. So this solution is correct. What I'd like you to do now is to please try D, E, and F on your own. Please pause the video and then look at the answers shortly. There's one thing I want to talk to you about too while you're checking your answers. As mentioned in our building background, the very first sheet, if you don't want to write the number 7 over 1, you could write it as 7 next to the x if you prefer, because side by side means multiply, so I'm multiplying. So if you don't want to write the 1, you can write the number, whatever number that you see being in the numerator, or being divided rather by 7. You can write that same number at the top, and what's going to happen is we're going to get 1x equals 7. However, many of my students were more comfortable continuing to show that they're in fraction form on one side and not on fraction form on the other side. It's really up to you. Problem E would be W equals 48. And this, when we write it in fraction form, we just have this in-between step, but I think that sometimes helps clarify it. And F, you can always write, if you don't like seeing it the way that it's written, you could write it, you could just reverse sides. However, I do want to solve it as written so you know that that's possible to do. I'm going to start on the side where the variable is. Since it looks like a fraction, I'm going to write it as a fraction. And what I will get is 44 equals 4y. We don't want to write this as y4. We want to always put our number first over 4. And then, of course, 4 divided by 4 is 1y, which is just y, and y equals 44. Please turn to page 20. Okay, we just have one more problem I want to do with you, and I'm going to ask you to try this on your own. We're going to do a very similar thing. This time, though, however, we have integers, and integers meaning positive and negative numbers. So we're going to show a Murphy-Dillon face, or Murphy-Dillon or the Margar faces, and better yet would be your calculator. So we have to be really careful with these signs. If I'm dividing by 4, I have a negative 4. I have to multiply by a negative 4 because that's how I'm going to get a positive variable. I want the variable to be positive. The opposite thing that I'm doing is not going to be a positive 4. It's going to be that I'm multiplying. So my opposite operation is going to be multiplication. So I'm going to start out with my wall. I'm going to multiply. Since this looks like a fraction, I'm going to choose to use it as negative 4 over 1 on this side. And on this side, since it looks like it is a whole number, I'm going to just use my integer 4. These both still mean the same thing, just written in different forms. And I'm multiplying on both sides. And just like we did on the front, negative 4w, and 1 times negative 4 is negative 4. On this side, oh, okay, now I have to be a little bit more careful. I'm going to have a positive times a negative. I'm going to get a negative. When she's halfway awake, she's mad. And so I'm going to get negative 24. What happens over here now is I have a negative divided by a negative, which is going to give me a positive. So I get a positive coefficient of 1, and that's great because I want a positive w. I do not want a negative variable. I want a positive variable, and we've already established that w is negative 4. Please complete the rest of these problems on your own. Then take a picture of your work and submit it. Make sure that you're showing all of your solving steps. Thank you.